Blackwood Hall's doors creak open to reveal a deadly secret. Welcome to Marsh Shadow Files. I am your host, Lucian. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? Your engagement makes this community incredible. Let's investigate. The late afternoon light filtered through the diamond-paned windows of Blackwood Hall's great hall, casting geometric shadows across Persian carpets that had witnessed 4 centuries of family gatherings. Inspector Roderick Alleyn paused in the doorway, his practiced eye taking in the theatrical grandeur before him. The hall retained its Jacobean magnificence, though closer inspection revealed the subtle signs of genteel decline. Faded gilt on ancestral portraits, carefully mended tapestries, and the telltale rectangles on the paneled walls where more valuable paintings had once hung. The air carried the mingled scents of beeswax and old wood, while from somewhere in the depths of the house, a grandfather clock marked time with measured authority. Inspector Alleyn, how perfectly delightful. Lady Honoria Blackwood approached with the measured grace of one born to command, her silver hair arranged in elaborate waves that spoke of an earlier, more formal era. She extended a gloved hand with the expectation of deference, though her pale blue eyes assessed him with shrewd intelligence. Lord Pemberton spoke so highly of your appreciation for historical pageantry. We are quite transported with excitement about tomorrow's performance. Alleyn inclined his head with the courtesy that had served him equally well in drawing rooms and police stations. Lady Honoria, the honor is entirely mine. I confess myself eager to witness history brought to life in its original setting. He allowed his gaze to sweep the hall once more, noting the makeshift staging area where servants moved with quiet efficiency under theatrical direction. You must meet my son Adrian, Lady Honoria continued, though something in her tone suggested that Adrian's enthusiasm might be cause for maternal concern. He has thrown himself into this celebration with remarkable vigor. As if summoned by his name, Lord Adrian Blackwood emerged from behind the staging area, his face flushed with exertion and what Alleyn suspected might be more than afternoon tea. He was a man in his early 50s, possessing the kind of faded handsomeness that suggested a youth spent in more carefree circumstances than his present situation allowed. His greeting carried an almost desperate bonhomie. Inspector Alleyn, capital, absolutely capital that you've come. We're recreating the very ceremony that elevated the first Lord Blackwood. 400 years of history, you know, brought back to life in the very hall where it all began. Adrian's enthusiasm held a brittle quality, like fine porcelain under strain. The gentleman directing the servants approached with theatrical precision. Captain Geoffrey Harcourt possessed the kind of professional bearing that suggested long experience managing temperamental performers. Inspector, a pleasure. I'm directing this little production, though I must say the Blackwood family provides quite enough drama without theatrical embellishment. His smile was cordial, but his eyes held the wariness of a man accustomed to difficult productions. Geoffrey has been invaluable, Lady Honoria observed, though her tone suggested his expertise came at considerable cost. His knowledge has transformed our simple family celebration into something quite grand. A woman appeared at Lady Honoria's elbow with the silent efficiency of long practice. Miss Lydia Thornfield was perhaps 45, with the unremarkable appearance that served companions well, though Alleyn noted the intelligence in her dark eyes and the way she anticipated Lady Honoria's needs before they were expressed. Miss Thornfield manages everything, Lady Honoria continued with genuine affection. 20 years she's been with us, and her knowledge of the family papers has proved invaluable for ensuring historical accuracy. Miss Thornfield inclined her head with modest grace. The Blackwood archives are remarkably complete, Inspector. It has been a privilege to help preserve the family's heritage. Her voice was cultured, with the careful diction of one who had learned proper speech rather than inherited it. Dr. Julian Whitmore approached from the library's direction, a leather portfolio under his arm and the slightly distracted air of a scholar interrupted in research. He was perhaps 60, with distinguished bearing that inspired confidence in both drawing rooms and sick rooms. "Inspector, I've been looking forward to our meeting. I understand you appreciate historical accuracy. The family records are quite fascinating. Some rather surprising discoveries, actually." As the group gathered in the fading light, Alleyn observed the subtle currents flowing between them. Affection was present, certainly, but also tension, and beneath the civilized veneer of upper-class hospitality, he sensed the kind of desperation that could drive people to extraordinary measures. A whispered conversation between Lord Adrian and Captain Harcourt ceased abruptly when he approached. Miss Thornfield's hands, arranging papers on a side table, did not shake, but Alleyn noticed how her gaze lingered on Lord Adrian when he spoke of the pageant's expense, a fleeting expression of concern quickly masked. The clock in the hall struck the quarter hour with a sound too loud for the room, and one of the portraits, badly hung, made a small reproachful click against its wire. Mrs. Fairfax appeared with the quiet authority of one who commanded whole households to settle, her keys chiming softly as she moved. "The great hall must be cleared after dinner, if you please," she murmured, no one in particular, though her meaning was clear. Alleyn noted such domestic trifles as other men noted titles and precedents. The stage was set, quite literally, for whatever drama the weekend might bring, and he found himself wondering why a ceremonial sword, which had lain undisturbed for years, should suddenly require locking away on this particular evening. The morning light filtered through the diamond-paned windows of the great hall with deliberate grace, casting geometric patterns across flagstones that had been swept to theatrical perfection. The room had undergone a transformation overnight, its ancient grandeur now serving as backdrop for a more intimate drama. Makeshift flats and carefully arranged furniture created the illusion of a medieval court, while the scent of old wood mingled with the more practical odors of stage paint and freshly polished brass. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that fell across the raised dais where history would soon be recreated, and from the minstrel's gallery above, a thin thread of electric cable wound discreetly through the ancient oak, apologizing for its presence with modern efficiency. Captain Geoffrey Harcourt moved about the space with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to transforming amateur enthusiasm into theatrical reality. His prompt book lay open on a side table, marked with the kind of detailed annotations that suggested long experience with difficult productions. "The approach must be stately," he announced to the assembled company, his voice carrying the expectation of obedience without raising itself above conversational level. 3 measured paces to the dais, pause for the presentation, then the ceremonial acknowledgement. Each movement has been prescribed by tradition and must be observed exactly. Lord Adrian emerged from the muniment room carrying the ceremonial sword with reverent care, though Inspector Alleyn observed how his hands trembled slightly as he placed the weapon on its appointed table. The blade caught the morning light with surprising brilliance, its edge appearing rather more functional than one might expect from a purely decorative piece. "Magnificent, isn't it?" Adrian remarked, though his voice held a note of strain that suggested the morning's preparations had already taxed his reserves. "For centuries it's been in the family. Saw actual service before becoming purely ceremonial." Dr. Julian Whitmore approached with his characteristic blend of scholarly enthusiasm and professional discretion, setting down his medical bag to examine the weapon more closely. "The family records are quite specific about its provenance," he observed, his fingers tracing the blade's surface with delicate precision. "Though I must confess some concern about its condition. The edge remains remarkably sharp for a piece of such antiquity." His examination seemed to extend beyond mere historical interest, and Alleyn noted the physician's professional assessment of an instrument that could prove dangerous in unsteady hands. Miss Lydia Thornfield appeared with an armful of period costumes, her movements characteristically efficient despite the awkwardness of her burden. She had prepared each garment with obvious care, pressing and arranging them with the attention to detail that marked her approach to all domestic matters. "The robes require some adjustment," she announced with quiet authority, her voice carrying the cultured tones of one who had learned proper speech rather than inherited it. "Lord Adrian, if you would be so good as to try the ceremonial vestments, I believe we can achieve a more authentic appearance." As Adrian donned the ancient robes, the heavy brocade seemed to emphasize his essential frailty rather than lending him dignity. The ceremonial garments hung awkwardly on his diminished frame, and when he attempted the prescribed gestures, he moved with visible effort. Lady Honoria entered at that moment, her mourning dress impeccable despite the early hour, surveying the preparations with the kind of critical satisfaction that brooked no opposition to her will. "The family portraits must witness this recreation," she declared, gesturing toward the ancestral gallery with her walking stick. 4 centuries of Blackwoods will observe their descendant, honoring their memory. Her words carried the weight of absolute expectation, though Alleyn detected a certain tension in her bearing that suggested even Lady Honoria was not entirely confident in the day's proceedings. The rehearsal began with Captain Harcourt calling for positions, his theatrical training evident in the way he orchestrated the ceremony's complex choreography. Lord Adrian made his approach to the symbolic throne, but as he raised the ancient sword in the prescribed gesture of triumph, his foot caught on the edge of the Persian carpet. The stumble was neither dramatic nor particularly alarming, yet it sent a ripple of concern through the assembled company. The ceremonial sword tilted dangerously, and Miss Thornfield moved with swift efficiency to steady both the weapon and its bearer. Dr. Whitmore was at Adrian's side before the echo of the misstep had faded, his hands checking pulse and color with the discreet expertise of long practice. "Perhaps a moment's rest," he suggested with careful neutrality, though his eyes met Alleyn's across the room with an expression that conveyed deeper concern than his words admitted. Adrian waved away the suggestion with a gesture that required more effort than it should, but he accepted the chair that Mrs. Fairfax provided with her usual practical efficiency. "The morning's exertions have been considerable," Dr. Whitmore observed quietly, though his professional assessment carried implications that extended beyond mere fatigue. Adrian's face had taken on an unhealthy pallor, and when he rose to continue the rehearsal, his movements suggested a man conserving strength for more important battles ahead. As the rehearsal concluded, Alleyn found himself studying the stage where history would soon be recreated. The ceremonial sword lay in its appointed place, polished to a luster that seemed almost aggressive in the gentle morning light. He noted the precise choreography required for the performance, the various opportunities for mishap that ceremony inevitably created, and the way each member of the household had positioned themselves to observe not just the rehearsal, but each other's reactions to its small dramas. The morning ended with Lord Adrian drawing Dr. Whitmore aside for a private consultation, their conversation conducted in tones too low for others to overhear. Alleyn observed their expressions from across the room, Adrian's face etched with a weariness that seemed to extend beyond physical fatigue, while Dr. Whitmore bore the grave, professional concern of a physician delivering news that no patient wishes to hear. When they parted, Adrian remained standing alone by the tall windows, a solitary figure against the brightening day, carrying burdens that the ancient robes could neither conceal nor dignify. The great hall fell quiet except for the soft sounds of Mrs. Fairfax directing the careful storage of props and costumes. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour with measured authority, marking time toward an afternoon that promised to transform rehearsal into reality. Though Alleyn found himself wondering whether the performance would prove to be tragedy or mere pageant. The great hall had acquired that peculiar quality of expectant hush that transforms ordinary spaces into something altogether more significant, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. The afternoon light, filtered through diamond-paned windows and supplemented by discreetly placed electric lamps, cast a warm glow across the makeshift staging area where history would soon be recreated. Ancient tapestries absorbed both sound and light, creating an atmosphere of muffled intimacy that seemed to draw the small gathering into conspiracy with the past. From the minstrel's gallery above, geometric shadows fell across the flagstones in patterns that suggested both sanctuary and surveillance, while the scent of beeswax candles mingled with the more modern odors of theatrical preparation. Inspector Alleyn positioned himself near the great fireplace, where carved heraldic beasts regarded the proceedings with stone indifference. His vantage point commanded both the performance area and the assembled audience, allowing him to observe the subtle dynamics that distinguished this gathering from ordinary social occasions. The intimacy of the setting seemed to heighten rather than diminish the tensions he had noted earlier, as if close quarters made concealment more necessary and therefore more precarious. Miss Lydia Thornfield moved between the staging area and the makeshift dressing space with characteristic precision, her arms laden with final costume adjustments and ceremonial accessories. Her movements possessed the controlled efficiency that marked her management of complex household arrangements, yet Alleyn observed something almost compulsive in the way she smoothed already perfect fabric and repositioned objects that required no adjustment. When she paused to examine the ceremonial sword, her fingers traced its ancient engravings with an intimacy that suggested familiarity, extending beyond mere curatorial interest. Dr. Julian Whitmore approached the dais, carrying his medical bag, a precaution that seemed both prudent and ominous given Lord Adrian's recent indisposition. His examination of the ceremonial implements was thorough, extending from the sword to the ornate chalice that would feature in the ceremony's climactic moment. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured, lifting the blade to catch the light. The original edge, though dulled by centuries, retains a surprising keenness. One might almost imagine it could still serve its original purpose, if circumstances required. His words, delivered in scholarly tones, seemed to hang in the air with implications that extended beyond historical appreciation. Captain Geoffrey Harcourt emerged from behind the screens with theatrical authority, his final survey of the lighting arrangements conducted with professional thoroughness. "All is in readiness, Lady Honoria," he announced, gesturing toward the control panel cleverly concealed within an antique oak cabinet. "The illumination will enhance the period atmosphere without sacrificing clarity. A delicate balance, as you might imagine." His attention moved between the technical arrangements and the human elements of the performance with equal scrutiny, as if assessing readiness for roles that extended beyond mere pageantry. Lady Honoria took her position of honor with regal composure, her walking stick planted firmly on the ancient flagstones as if claiming territorial rights that stretched back through centuries of family occupation. "The Blackwood legacy is one of endurance," she declared, her voice carrying both pride and an undertone of anxiety that Alleyn found revealing. "Every stone of this house, every heirloom, speaks of a history that has defied the whims of fortune. Adrian will do it justice, I'm certain." Her confidence seemed to require assertion rather than emanating naturally, and her sharp eyes surveyed the preparations with unusual intensity. As the moment of performance approached, Lord Adrian emerged from behind the makeshift screen in full ceremonial regalia. The ancient robes transformed him into a figure of considerable dignity, though the transformation appeared to exact a physical cost that theatrical lighting could not entirely disguise. His complexion had acquired an unhealthy pallor, and when he lifted the ceremonial sword for a practiced gesture, his hands trembled with effort that extended beyond ordinary stage nerves. The heavy brocade seemed to emphasize his essential frailty rather than lending him the gravitas the ceremony required. The small audience settled into expectant silence, though Alleyn observed that the quiet was not entirely peaceful. Whispered conversations ceased abruptly when participants noticed his attention, and meaningful glances passed between members of the household with frequency that suggested communication extending beyond the ceremony's requirements. Mrs. Fairfax appeared with her usual silent efficiency, carrying refreshments for the post-performance reception, though her movements suggested familiarity with the house's hidden passages and architectural peculiarities that might prove significant beyond mere domestic convenience. Captain Harcourt took his position at the lighting controls, while Miss Thornfield made final adjustments to Lord Adrian's costume, her hands steady despite the tension that seemed to affect everyone present. The performance began with stately grandeur, Lord Adrian's voice clear and commanding as he delivered the historical monologue that would culminate in the symbolic recreation of his ancestors' elevation. Yet Alleyn noted subtle deviations from the rehearsed choreography, a pause that lasted a heartbeat too long, a gesture that faltered before completing its prescribed arc, a tremor at the jawline that had not been present during the morning's preparations. As the ceremony progressed toward its climactic moment, the great hall seemed to hold its breath. The ceremonial cup, which Miss Thornfield had positioned with such care earlier, now stood a hand's breadth from its original placement, its rim catching the light as if recently disturbed. Dr. Whitmore stood ready with his medical bag, his professional attention focused on Lord Adrian with an intensity that suggested concerns extending beyond ordinary theatrical mishaps. From the minstrel's gallery above came the faint scrape of a shoe against oak, though when Alleyn glanced upward, he found only shadows that declined to explain themselves. The ancient walls, silent witnesses to generations of Blackwood triumphs and tragedies, seemed to lean inward as the performance approached its moment of triumph. Yet something in the quality of the silence, in the way the candlelight flickered without apparent cause, suggested that the drama about to unfold might prove more contemporary and more dangerous than the medieval pageant it purported to recreate. The clock in the hall marked time with measured authority, counting toward a moment that would transform celebration into something altogether more sinister, though none present could yet imagine the tragedy that awaited behind the mask of family honor. The great hall had achieved that moment of perfect theatrical suspension when all elements converge into inevitable destiny, the very air seeming to thicken with the weight of centuries watching from gilt frames and shadowed corners. Candles burned in iron sconces, and along the dais in silver sticks, their flames trembling in response to movements that strove to be noiseless, while the scent of beeswax and old wood created an atmosphere that seemed to blur the boundaries between past and present. Lord Adrian stood center stage in his ancestral robes, the heavy brocade lending him a dignity that his everyday appearance had long since surrendered to time's erosions, though Inspector Alleyn observed how the weight of the ceremonial garments seemed to claim his shoulders rather than enhance them. The small audience had drawn itself into a crescent near the edges of the makeshift stage, their faces illuminated by the shifting candlelight in expressions of polite anticipation mixed with familial pride. Lady Honoria sat slightly apart, her walking stick planted firmly between her gloves, as composed as any matriarch beneath ancestral portraiture, though her sharp eyes surveyed the proceedings with unusual intensity. Captain Geoffrey Harcourt had positioned himself near the concealed lighting controls, his theatrical training evident in the way he orchestrated the ceremony's visual effects with professional discretion. Miss Lydia Thornfield moved at the margins with characteristic efficiency, making final adjustments to the ceremonial table where the ancient chalice caught the light with almost aggressive brilliance. Dr. Julian Whitmore had placed his medical bag discreetly beneath a chair against the wall, its very presence casting a subtle reserve upon the attempt at celebration, while Mrs. Fairfax moved with her usual silent authority, carrying refreshments for the post-performance reception, though her movements suggested familiarity with the house's architectural peculiarities that extended beyond mere domestic convenience. The ceremonial sword lay in its appointed place beside the ornate cup, polished until its engravings scattered the candlelight in prismatic reflections across the ancient stone walls. At Captain Harcourt's signal, the murmur of conversation subsided into expectant silence. Lord Adrian began his approach to the symbolic throne with measured steps that spoke of careful rehearsal, though Alleyn noted a certain rigidity in his movements that suggested considerable effort behind the stately progress. The prescribed words of ancestral triumph rang clear and strong through the vaulted space, carrying conviction that his physical frailty might otherwise have denied, while the formula preserved in family documents seemed to invest the moment with genuine significance rather than mere theatrical effect. "By right of blood and service to the crown," Adrian declared, his voice achieving the resonance that 4 centuries of family history demanded, "I accept the honors that duty has earned and responsibility requires." As he lifted the ceremonial chalice in the prescribed gesture of triumph, the ancient silver surface reflected the candlelight with a luster that seemed to pulse with its own inner fire. Yet even as the words echoed in the hall's vaulted space, something in Lord Adrian's bearing began to falter with alarming subtlety. The transformation began so gradually that the small audience initially mistook it for theatrical emphasis. Adrian's hand, which had held the chalice with steady authority, developed a slight tremor that sent ripples across the silver surface, while the color that stage lighting had enhanced to suggest robust health began to drain from his complexion with visible rapidity. His free hand moved to his throat in a gesture that might have been interpreted as dramatic flourish, had it not been accompanied by a look of genuine distress that no amount of amateur theatricality could have produced. Dr. Whitmore leaned forward with professional alertness, his movements subtle enough to avoid disrupting the ceremony's progress, though his face had acquired that particular stillness which belongs to the trained when routine proves insufficient. The ceremonial sword, still held in Adrian's other hand, began to waver as his grip loosened, its weight becoming suddenly too much for muscles that seemed to be failing with each passing moment. There was no warning beyond a slight alteration in the sound of Adrian's breathing. He hesitated, as if the next line had slipped from reach, and then the moment that had read as high acting transformed into something altogether more sinister. For a heartbeat, a spatter of genteel applause, short and embarrassed, answered what appeared to be theatrical climax. Then the illusion shattered as Lord Adrian's knees buckled with sudden finality, sending him crashing to the flagstones in a fall that echoed through the vaulted space with sickening authenticity. The small audience erupted in controlled chaos, their upper-class training asserting itself even in crisis, though a lady's muffled exclamation broke like a stitch in the sudden silence. Dr. Whitmore was instantly upon his knees beside the fallen man, his hands decisive and his face acquiring the grave neutrality that physicians adopt when confronting situations beyond their skill to remedy. "A little air," he said softly, without looking up. "If you please, no one crowd him." Captain Harcourt, responding to theatrical instinct born of countless stage crises, swept down the lighting switches, plunging the hall into relative shadow that flattened faces and made the candles seem distant and inadequate. The well-intentioned mistake arrested movement toward the fallen figure. Voices altered curiously, and a senseless, momentary uncertainty took hold, as if darkness were the thing to set right before the human emergency could be addressed. "Leave the doors," Alleyn said, not loudly, yet the calm authority of it made itself obeyed. "No one need move, Mr. Harcourt. A trifle more light, if you please." The amber illumination returned, thinner now but sufficient to reveal the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Fairfax appeared with brandy and smelling salts, which Dr. Whitmore waved aside with a small, decisive gesture that spoke volumes about the futility of such remedies. Miss Thornfield had come to stand quite still at the foot of the dais, her hands folded so strictly that the knuckles whitened, while Lady Honoria remained seated, though her head inclined as if to hear the doctor's verdict before he shaped it. When Dr. Whitmore finally looked up, his expression conveyed more than words could communicate, and his quiet pronouncement that "it is over" seemed to be absorbed by the ancient tapestries as within the proper catalogue of Blackwood events. Inspector Alleyn, his holiday mood entirely abandoned, moved forward with the quiet authority that had served him through countless investigations, though he hoped fervently that this domestic tragedy would prove nothing more sinister than the natural conclusion of a life lived under considerable strain. Yet something in the quality of Lord Adrian's collapse, in the precise timing of his physical failure, suggested complexities that extended beyond mere medical emergency. He positioned himself near the ceremonial table and cast his practiced eye over the objects there, noting without touching how the cup's lip bore a faint pearly mark where a mouth had met it, and how a napkin placed just so showed the slightest of stains at one corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn said, his voice now entirely professional, though no less courteous, "it will be necessary that we disturb nothing until the local authorities arrive. Pray forgive me if I ask that you remain where you are for a few moments." There was no protest. In houses such as this, obedience to proper authority was a habit well learned, and the transformation of celebration into tragedy required its own protocols of civilized behavior. In the momentary stillness that followed, a small sound came from above, the faint click of wood somewhere in the vicinity of the minstrel's gallery, a harmless contraction of timber in cooling air, perhaps, or something brushed in passing. Alleyn raised his head and studied the shadowed balustrade with the attention he gave to details that declined to explain themselves. The candles sent up their minute noises, the carpets held their secrets, and beyond the leaded panes the light had altered its tone toward evening. Nothing moved in the gallery's darkness, yet there had been that sound, small and disquieting as a mislaid line in a meticulously rehearsed play, suggesting that the drama which had unfolded on the ancient flagstones might prove to have more players than those who had taken their bows in the candlelight below. The drawing-room at Blackwood Hall possessed that particular quality of faded elegance that spoke of generations maintaining appearances through increasingly difficult circumstances, its silk wallpaper bearing the subtle patina of age, while Persian carpets showed careful mending at their borders. A fire burned with disciplined authority behind brass bars, sending up whispers that scarcely disturbed the hush of thick carpets and the measured tick of a buhl clock on the mantelpiece. Porcelain shepherdesses presided over the chimney-piece with painted indifference, while the scent of beeswax and old leather mingled with something faintly medicinal that seemed to cling to the very fabric of the room. The local constabulary had arrived with admirable efficiency, their preliminary examination confirming what Dr. Whitmore's professional assessment had already suggested. Lord Adrian's death bore the hallmarks of poisoning, administered with precision that spoke of knowledge extending beyond amateur malice. Inspector Alleyn, his holiday mood entirely abandoned, had positioned himself near the escritoire, where family correspondence lay in neat stacks, his practiced eye noting the quality of stationery and the careful economy with which it had been employed. Lady Honoria entered with the measured dignity that had sustained her through decades of social obligation, settling into her accustomed chair with composure that seemed entirely natural rather than assumed. She had changed into mourning attire with remarkable efficiency, the transformation lending her an air of tragic nobility that spoke of long experience with family crises. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, her voice carrying the clarity that refused self-pity, "I understand you require certain information. We shall behave as Blackwoods have always behaved." She permitted herself to touch the rim of her teacup as if to steady its place on the saucer. "Adrian's death is a grief to his family and, if I may say so, to the county. He insisted upon managing the pageant himself. He had a sense of theatre, not always to the family's advantage." Alleyn inclined his head with the courtesy that served him equally well in drawing-rooms and police stations. "Your son's health had been a matter of concern recently?" The slight tightening around Lady Honoria's eyes suggested the question touched upon matters she would have preferred to keep private. Adrian had been under considerable strain. Income is not inexhaustible, Inspector, and the Hall is a creature of insatiable appetite. He spoke, too freely, I thought, of realizing certain objects in order to preserve the whole. Her gaze moved to the portraits in their tarnished frames. We have been custodians rather than owners. One does what one must. Miss Lydia Thornfield entered, carrying a tea service arranged with meticulous attention to detail, her movements possessing their usual efficiency, though Alleyn observed a certain rigidity in her bearing that suggested considerable effort behind the composed facade. "I thought refreshments might be welcome," she said with quiet authority, her voice carrying the cultured tones that spoke of education rather than birth. As she arranged the service with practiced grace, Alleyn noted how her hands remained perfectly steady despite the day's traumatic events. "Miss Thornfield," Alleyn said gently, "your familiarity with the family's arrangements has been mentioned. You managed the ceremonial table." "I laid the table at noon," she replied with that precise clarity he had observed earlier. "The chalice was polished yesterday, lined with muslin cloth to protect the interior, and positioned exactly where the original records indicate it should stand. I adjusted Lord Adrian's robes before the performance, and again just before his speech." Her emotional detachment was remarkable, her voice maintaining an even monotone as if she were cataloguing facts for a historical record rather than recounting the final moments of a man she had served for decades. Dr. Julian Whitmore appeared with the grave bearing that had marked his demeanor since the tragedy's discovery, his medical bag still in hand, though its contents could no longer serve their intended purpose. "Inspector, I've completed my preliminary examination. The symptoms suggest a rapid-acting poison, administered perhaps 20 to 30 minutes before the collapse. Adrian's constitution had been under considerable strain. I had been treating him for a progressive condition that would have eventually proven challenging." Lady Honoria received this information with stoic dignity, though her knuckles whitened as she gripped her walking stick. "Dr. Whitmore has been our family physician for more than 20 years. His devotion to Adrian's welfare has been beyond question." Captain Geoffrey Harcourt presented himself with the practical air of a man whose carefully constructed production had been abruptly dismantled. "The timing was quite precise, Inspector," he remarked with grim professional assessment. "The collapse occurred at the dramatic zenith. I altered the lighting during the fall. Instinct, I'm afraid. I accept it may have been a mistake." Mrs. Fairfax entered with her characteristic silent efficiency, her keys making soft domestic music as she refreshed the tea service. "I've seen that the hall is secured, sir," she said to Alleyn with formality that made him momentarily part of the household furniture. "The staff will wait in the morning room if it's your wish." As the afternoon light shifted through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across worn carpets, Alleyn reflected on the complex dynamics that had shaped life at Blackwood Hall. The financial pressures Lady Honoria mentioned with such delicate restraint clearly extended beyond mere inconvenience, while Miss Thornfield's devotion carried an intensity that suggested personal investment extending beyond professional duty. The drawing room fell into contemplative silence, broken only by soft sounds of china against china and the measured tick of the mantelpiece clock. Alleyn's eye fell on the tea service, where one spoon among its fellows had acquired a dull bloom along the bowl, as if from some brief, unwise contact. On the low table beside Lady Honoria's chair, a folded napkin lay too white, too new, bearing the faintest shadow of a stain at one corner. "The chalice," Alleyn said, as if asking after a hat. "Where is it now?" There was a small silence. Miss Thornfield said, very evenly, "I took it to be cleaned." Lady Honoria did not turn her head. The spoon lay quiet in the lamplight, and beyond the drawn curtains the lawns of Blackwood Hall had grown perfectly still, as if the ancient house itself were holding its breath around secrets that might prove more dangerous than the poison that had claimed Lord Adrian's life. The muniment room at Blackwood Hall occupied a corner of the oldest wing, its stone walls bearing witness to 4 centuries of meticulous record-keeping that had preserved the family's history through wars, social upheavals, and the gradual erosion of aristocratic privilege. The air within carried the distinctive scent of old parchment and leather bindings, while narrow windows admitted thin streams of afternoon light that illuminated motes of ancient dust dancing above oak tables scarred by generations of scholarly attention. Iron-bound chests lined the walls like silent sentinels, their brass fittings dulled by time but still bearing the unmistakable marks of recent handling. A writing table stood beneath the narrow window, its leather blotter bearing the furred edges of long service, while brass candlesticks and a paper knife suggested work that continued after daylight failed. Miss Lydia Thornfield unlocked the studded door with practiced efficiency, her ring of labeled keys selecting the proper mechanism without conscious thought. She moved through this repository of family memory with the familiarity of long devotion, her cultured voice echoing softly in the vaulted space as she guided Inspector Alleyn through the labyrinthine collection. "The Blackwood papers are remarkably complete, Inspector," she observed with quiet pride, her hands moving across leather-bound volumes with reverent care. Very little has been lost, though certain periods required more careful preservation than others. Her manner was composed and precise, yet Alleyn noted how she positioned herself between him and certain sections of the archives, as if her very presence could shield sensitive materials from unwelcome scrutiny. Dr. Julian Whitmore appeared in the doorway with his characteristic blend of scholarly enthusiasm and professional discretion, carrying a portfolio that suggested his historical research extended beyond casual interest. "Inspector, I've been working with these records for several years," he said, his academic manner unable to entirely disguise the gravity of his expression. "The family's medical and genealogical history provides fascinating material, though some discoveries have proved rather disturbing to those who prefer the official version of events." His words carried the careful weight of a scholar who had uncovered truths that others wished to keep buried. Alleyn examined the shelves with careful attention, noting how the cataloging system revealed the family's transformation from medieval prominence to their current state of genteel decline. Recent correspondence, filed with Miss Thornfield's characteristic precision, documented Lord Adrian's mounting financial difficulties with embarrassing clarity. Letters from antiquarian dealers, valuations of family heirlooms, and negotiations for the sale of outlying properties painted a picture of desperate measures concealed behind aristocratic dignity. "These arrangements with collectors," Alleyn observed, indicating a file of recent correspondence, "suggest considerable pressure behind Lord Adrian's public composure." Miss Thornfield's hands stilled on the documents she had been arranging, though her voice remained carefully controlled. Lord Adrian was devoted to preserving the family legacy. He explored every possible avenue before considering more drastic measures. Her defensive loyalty carried a note of personal investment that extended beyond professional duty, while her intimate knowledge of the archives clearly encompassed which documents might prove embarrassing if subjected to external scrutiny. Dr. Whitmore moved to another section, his attention focused on a collection that appeared to have been recently disturbed. The brass lock showed brighter patches where metal had rubbed against metal, while a minute curl of cream-laid paper on the shelf beneath suggested hasty handling. "I'm afraid my research has uncovered certain irregularities in the official genealogy," he said with scholarly reluctance. "The family records, so carefully maintained through the centuries, contain what appear to be deliberate omissions. Certain births and relationships have been expunged with considerable care." The implications settled over the room like dust from ancient bindings. Miss Thornfield continued her work with mechanical precision, though Alleyn observed how her movements had acquired the rigid quality of someone maintaining composure through considerable effort. Her familiarity with the family's hidden history was clearly extensive, encompassing not only which secrets existed, but where the evidence had been carefully stored away from casual discovery. Mrs. Fairfax entered with her customary silent authority, carrying a feather duster that seemed to serve as both practical tool and badge of domestic office. "I beg your pardon, Miss Thornfield," she said with formal courtesy. "The lower passage is secured, and I've instructed the staff to avoid the gallery until you give permission. The backup keys are in their usual place, should you require them." Her knowledge of the house's architectural peculiarities extended to passages and compartments that had served various purposes through centuries of political uncertainty. As Mrs. Fairfax moved about the room with professional efficiency, she indicated a section of paneling where carved fruit and flowers made their disciplined parade. "There's a useful cupboard behind the carving, Inspector, if you didn't know. The catch is under the carved thistle. They used to keep the more private documents there during uncertain times." Her practical wisdom carried the authority of decades spent managing a house that kept its own counsel about family secrets. Alleyn examined the paneling and found the mechanism, pressing the carved thistle until he felt the slight give of an old catch. A narrow door swung inward with a soft sigh, revealing a shallow recess lined with cedar. Within, a fragment of sealing wax lay upon the shelf, recently broken, its surface holding the clean impression of the Blackwood crest. Beside it, a square of paper had been cut neatly away from some larger document, while the faint shadow left by an eraser suggested systematic alteration of records. The discovery cast new light on the systematic management of family reputation. Miss Thornfield stood perfectly still, her keys quiet in her hand, while Dr. Whitmore adjusted his spectacles, though they required no adjustment. The evidence suggested that someone had been conducting careful revision of the family's documented history, removing or altering information that could prove damaging to the Blackwood name. Among the papers on the writing table, Alleyn discovered correspondence indicating that Lord Adrian had recently learned disturbing information about his family's hidden past. His handwriting, normally precise, showed signs of considerable agitation in letters dated just days before his death. The content suggested knowledge of family secrets that had caused him profound distress, while draft correspondence bore evidence of his intention to acknowledge publicly what had been suppressed for generations. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the ancient stones, the muniment room seemed to whisper with secrets that had been carefully preserved through centuries of social change. The very completeness of the Blackwood records, so meticulously maintained through political upheaval and social transformation, now served to document both the family's proud heritage and its more troubling realities with equal precision. In the writing table's blotter, when lifted to catch the light, Alleyn made out the faint ghost of reversed script that hasty writing leaves behind. 2 words declared themselves with provoking economy: acknowledge and before. The implications were clear. Someone had been drafting correspondence that would have revealed family secrets, while the evidence in the hidden cupboard suggested equally systematic efforts to prevent such revelations. The room fell silent except for the soft rustle of ancient paper and the distant sound of the house settling into evening. From somewhere in the depths of the building came the most delicate tremor upon the air, as if a casement had been opened and reclosed, or a foot had found the spacing of an old stair. Mrs. Fairfax's eyes turned almost imperceptibly toward the inner door that gave access to passages running down to the kitchens and beyond to the garden, while in the unused fireplace grate, a pinch of recent ash suggested the destruction of documents that someone preferred not to leave for discovery. Miss Thornfield remained beside the oak table, her hands folded with characteristic precision, though her composure could not entirely conceal the tension that surrounded family secrets she had devoted her life to protecting. The muniment room, repository of Blackwood history, had revealed evidence of financial desperation, genealogical scandal, and systematic suppression of inconvenient truth. Yet it was the fragment of sealing wax with its fresh break and the ghost words on the blotter that suggested how dangerous such secrets could become when threatened with exposure. Somewhere in the house's depths, a clock chimed the hour with measured authority, marking time toward revelations that would prove more perilous than the ancient scandals they had been designed to protect. Dr. Julian Whitmore's consulting room occupied a corner of Blackwood Hall's east wing, its mullioned windows offering views of the formal gardens while maintaining the professional discretion that 20 years of family practice had required. Medical texts shared shelf space with volumes on local history and genealogy, their leather bindings softened by years of scholarly attention, while the scent of carbolic and old paper created an atmosphere that spoke of both healing and learning. A mahogany desk bore the tools of his dual vocations: stethoscope and magnifying glass, prescription pad and genealogical charts, arranged with the methodical precision that marked his approach to both medicine and historical research. The morning light, filtered through diamond panes, cast geometric patterns across Persian carpets that had witnessed decades of confidential consultations. Inspector Alleyn positioned himself near the fireplace, where a small coal fire provided warmth against the November chill, his practiced eye noting the subtle signs of professional strain that marked Dr. Whitmore's usually composed demeanor. The physician moved about his consulting room with characteristic precision, yet his movements possessed an uncharacteristic rigidity that suggested considerable effort behind his scholarly calm. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured authority of long medical practice, though something in his manner hinted at knowledge that extended beyond mere clinical observation. The poison employed was both sophisticated and readily available to someone with medical knowledge. Dr. Whitmore began, settling behind his desk with the gravity that had marked his bearing since the previous day's tragedy. Digitalis, administered in sufficient concentration to prove rapidly fatal. The symptoms Lord Adrian displayed were entirely consistent with acute cardiac glycoside poisoning: the pallor, the hand to the throat, the sudden collapse without convulsion. The timing suggests administration perhaps 20 to 30 minutes before the performance reached its climax. Mrs. Fairfax entered with her customary silent efficiency, carrying a tea service that seemed to materialize without summons, her keys making their familiar domestic music as she arranged the service with practiced grace. "Dr. Whitmore has been attending the family for more than 20 years, she observed, with the quiet authority of one whose service encompassed intimate knowledge of household arrangements. His devotion to Lord Adrian's welfare has been beyond question, though recent consultations had caused considerable concern among the staff." The housekeeper's words carried implications that seemed to settle over the room like dust from ancient volumes. Dr. Whitmore received her observation with professional composure, though his adjustment of already perfect spectacles suggested discomfort with the direction of the conversation. "I'd been treating Lord Adrian for a progressive cardiac condition that would have eventually proven fatal," he admitted with scholarly reluctance. His constitution had been under considerable strain, both physical and emotional. The irony, Inspector, is that the poison used to murder him was the very substance I'd been prescribing in therapeutic doses for his heart condition. Alleyn moved to examine the medical cabinet, whose glass front revealed rows of bottles arranged with pharmaceutical precision. Among them, a container of digitalis tincture showed signs of recent handling, its stopper slightly displaced despite the physician's usual meticulous habits. "Your access to pure preparations would be routine, Dr. Whitmore. The concentration required for murder, however, suggests someone with intimate knowledge of both pharmacology and the victim's physical vulnerabilities." "Indeed," the physician replied, his hands moving among his instruments with familiar precision, yet trembling slightly when handling certain bottles. "The therapeutic dose differs significantly from what would prove lethal. The murderer required not only access to the substance but precise knowledge of Lord Adrian's weight, general health, and the timing required for the poison to take effect during the ceremony's climactic moment." Dr. Whitmore rose and moved to a section of his library devoted to family histories, his finger tracing the spine of a leather-bound volume with evident reluctance. "My historical research, Inspector, has created what I can only describe as a profound moral dilemma. The Blackwood genealogy, so carefully maintained through the centuries, contains certain irregularities that I discovered quite by accident while researching the family's medical history. Lord Adrian learned of these findings recently, and they caused him considerable distress. The physician's scholarly integrity had clearly conflicted with his personal loyalty to the family, creating the kind of impossible choice that could drive desperate action. His knowledge of the family's physical and emotional vulnerabilities, combined with his access to lethal substances, made him uniquely positioned to exploit both medical expertise and intimate understanding of household routines. Mrs. Fairfax moved about the room with her usual domestic efficiency, though her attention remained alert to every nuance of the conversation. The family's medical arrangements have always been conducted with proper discretion, she observed with quiet authority. Dr. Whitmore's consultations with Lord Adrian had become more frequent recently, though the nature of their discussions was not for household speculation. As the morning progressed, the complex relationship between physician and patient emerged with disturbing clarity. Dr. Whitmore's long association with the Blackwood family had given him intimate knowledge of their secrets, both medical and genealogical, while his academic research had uncovered evidence that could destroy reputations as effectively as any poison could destroy life. The timing of Lord Adrian's death, coinciding with his apparent intention to acknowledge family secrets publicly, suggested more than mere coincidence. Alleyn examined the consulting room's appointments with careful attention, noting how recent disturbance had altered the physician's usually perfect order. A prescription pad showed the faint impression of recent writing, while a small glass vial on the desk bore traces of a substance that had left crystalline residue around its mouth. Among the medical instruments, a graduated measure showed signs of recent cleaning, though a faint stain on the blotting paper suggested hasty preparation of some solution. "Your position, Dr. Whitmore," Alleyn observed with careful neutrality, "places you in a unique situation of trust. Knowledge of a patient's vulnerabilities, both physical and personal, creates responsibilities that extend beyond mere medical practice." The physician stood by his window, his professional bearing unable to entirely conceal the weight of knowledge that had become burden rather than privilege. Lord Adrian was a man of conscience, Inspector. He believed in truth, even when it proved inconvenient to those he loved. My research had uncovered evidence of family secrets that previous generations had successfully suppressed, but Adrian felt that certain acknowledgments were required by honor, regardless of the consequences to family reputation. The consulting room fell into contemplative silence, broken only by the soft sounds of Mrs. Fairfax completing her domestic duties and the measured tick of a bracket clock upon the mantelpiece. The morning light continued its progress across furnishings that had witnessed generations of confidential consultations, while the evidence of recent medical preparation suggested applications that extended far beyond routine practice. Dr. Whitmore returned to his desk, his hands moving among papers with mechanical precision, though his eyes held the particular stillness that belongs to those who carry knowledge too dangerous to share. The family papers contain references to illegitimate births, Inspector. Matters which, if revealed, would not only embarrass the current generation, but could potentially affect the legal succession of the estate. Adrian wished to acknowledge these historical facts publicly, as a matter of family honor. In the growing stillness, Alleyn noted how the physician's medicine case, usually locked with professional discretion, stood slightly ajar, its brass fittings catching the light with accusatory brilliance. A small key lay beside it on the desk, recently used, while the faint, sweet scent of digitalis seemed to linger in the air despite the room's careful ventilation. The morning had revealed how medical knowledge could become dangerous when professional ethics conflicted with personal loyalty, while the evidence suggested that someone had exploited intimate understanding of both poison and patient to achieve ends that no legitimate medical practice could justify. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a door closed with soft finality, its sound carrying through passages that connected the consulting room to other areas where family secrets were preserved with equal care. Mrs. Fairfax's keys chimed softly as she departed, though her glance toward the medicine case carried implications that extended beyond domestic routine. The physician remained at his desk, surrounded by the tools of healing that could so easily become instruments of destruction, while the evidence of recent pharmaceutical preparation whispered of applications that had transformed medicine into murder with the precision that only professional knowledge could provide. Miss Lydia Thornfield's sitting room occupied a modest corner of the upper floor, its dimensions speaking of careful economy rather than generous provision, though every appointment had been selected with the discrimination that marked her management of more significant household arrangements. The morning light, filtered through casement windows that commanded a view of the kitchen gardens, revealed furnishings that possessed the particular quality of genteel restraint. A writing desk of good mahogany but modest proportions, bookshelves bearing volumes that suggested both education and systematic acquisition, and watercolor sketches of Indian landscapes that spoke of distant service in more exotic circumstances. The air carried the mingled scents of lavender and old leather, while a small coal fire provided warmth that seemed calculated with domestic precision rather than dispensed with aristocratic largesse. Inspector Alleyn positioned himself near the window where natural light might reveal details that artificial illumination could obscure, his practiced eye noting the subtle refinements that distinguished this modest apartment from ordinary servants' quarters. Miss Thornfield entered with her characteristic precision, carrying a tea service that she arranged with mechanical efficiency, though her movements possessed an unusual rigidity that suggested considerable effort behind her customary composure. When she spoke, her voice retained the cultured clarity that had marked their previous conversations, yet something in her bearing hinted at knowledge that extended far beyond her official position as Lady Honoria's companion. "Inspector Alleyn," she said with formal courtesy, settling into her chair with the measured grace of one accustomed to maintaining dignity within carefully prescribed boundaries. "I understand you require clarification regarding certain family arrangements. 20 years I've served in this household, and my devotion to their welfare has been absolute." Her words carried the weight of long service, though her hands, folded with characteristic precision upon her lap, betrayed a tension that her composed exterior could not entirely disguise. Mrs. Fairfax appeared in the doorway with her customary silent authority, her keys making their familiar domestic music as she surveyed the room with professional assessment. "Miss Thornfield's position has always been one of particular trust," she observed with quiet authority, moving to adjust a cushion that required no adjustment. "Her knowledge of family arrangements extends beyond ordinary household management, encompassing matters that require the utmost discretion." The housekeeper's words carried implications that seemed to settle over the small room like dust from ancient documents, while her glance toward the writing desk suggested familiarity with correspondence that others might find revealing. Alleyn moved to examine the bookshelves, where volumes on genealogy shared space with botanical texts and family histories, their arrangement suggesting systematic research that extended beyond casual interest. Among the botanical works, a treatise on Indian medicinal plants showed particular signs of consultation, its margins marked with penciled annotations that revealed detailed knowledge of preparation methods and therapeutic applications. "Your service in India," he observed with careful neutrality, "appears to have provided considerable expertise in matters extending beyond ordinary governess duties." Miss Thornfield's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, her hands moving among the papers on her desk with mechanical precision, though her eyes held the particular stillness that belongs to those who carry secrets too dangerous to share. "Colonial service requires resourcefulness, Inspector. The management of English households in tropical climates demands knowledge of local remedies and practical solutions to problems that do not arise in more temperate circumstances." Her academic manner could not entirely disguise the personal investment that marked her relationship with such specialized knowledge. On the writing desk, partially concealed beneath routine correspondence, lay a transcript bound in grey boards that bore the distinctive appearance of parish records. Alleyn indicated the volume with polite interest. Local genealogical research, Miss Thornfield. Your work in the muniment room suggests considerable scholarly application. When she made no immediate response, he continued with the same conversational tone. The parish registers of St. Mark's in the Wold contain entries of particular interest to students of family history. Certain christening records from the early years of this century, for instance, document arrangements that previous generations might have preferred to keep private. The small sitting room fell into expectant silence, broken only by the soft sounds of coals settling in the grate and the distant chiming of household clocks marking the passage of morning hours. Miss Thornfield remained motionless at her writing desk, her scholarly composure gradually giving way to something more vulnerable, though she maintained the dignity that had characterized her service through decades of careful concealment. The entry for 1904, Alleyn continued with gentle persistence, records the christening of Lydia, base-born, the mother's Christian name given as Ellen, the father's identity discreetly omitted. Dr. Whitmore's historical notes refer to charitable arrangements made privately for the education and placement of a child whose presence in the official record might have proved inconvenient to all parties concerned. His words fell into the quiet room with the weight of revelation, though his tone remained entirely conversational. Miss Thornfield lifted her eyes to meet his gaze with a directness that was neither challenging nor submissive, but remarkably clear. There are many Lydias, Inspector, and many Ellens. Yet one notices coincidences, as you so delicately phrase it. Her voice carried the cultured precision that had always marked her speech, though something in her manner suggested the careful construction of identity rather than its natural inheritance. Mrs. Fairfax moved about the room with her usual domestic efficiency, her attention drawn to details that others might overlook. The quality of stationery that exceeded a companion's usual means, the small silver items that bore unmistakable resemblance to pieces in the family collection, and the way Miss Thornfield's personal effects seemed to echo, in miniature, the appointments of the greater house. Miss Thornfield's connection to the Blackwood heritage, she observed with diplomatic discretion, encompasses relationships that previous generations preferred to manage with appropriate privacy. As the morning light shifted through the casement windows, casting new patterns across furnishings that had witnessed decades of careful silence, the true nature of Miss Thornfield's position became clear. Her devotion to the Blackwood family was not merely professional, but deeply personal, rooted in blood ties that could never be publicly acknowledged without destroying both her carefully constructed identity and the family reputation she had spent her life protecting. Lord Adrian had recently learned of these historical facts, Miss Thornfield said with quiet dignity, her voice carrying the weight of a secret preserved through decades of loyal service. He was a man of conscience, Inspector, who believed that certain acknowledgments were required by honor, regardless of the consequences to family reputation or to those whose positions might be affected by such revelations. Her confession revealed how nobility of purpose could create impossible conflicts when family honor demanded the suppression of truths that conscience required to be told. Alleyn noted how the botanical texts lay open to pages describing the extraction of active principles from common garden plants, while a small brass scale, tucked discreetly among other items on a shelf, showed traces of recent use. Near the window, a mortar and pestle of Indian manufacture bore the faint residue of grinding, though their surfaces had been cleaned with the thoroughness that marked Miss Thornfield's approach to all domestic tasks. The ceremonial chalice, he observed with the same conversational tone, which you removed for cleaning after the performance, a natural precaution given the family's regard for their heirlooms. When she made no response, he continued, though one wonders whether the cleaning was entirely successful. Certain substances, particularly those of botanical origin, can leave traces that resist ordinary methods of removal. Miss Thornfield rose from her desk with the measured grace that had characterized her movements throughout their conversation, though her composure now carried the weight of acknowledgement rather than concealment. The Blackwood legacy, Inspector, represents more than mere social position. It is the foundation upon which this house, this heritage, has endured through centuries of change and challenge. Some secrets are best preserved for the good of all concerned, particularly when their revelation would destroy rather than illuminate. The small sitting room held its breath in the growing silence, while beyond the windows the gardens of Blackwood Hall continued their ancient cycle of growth and decay, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded within walls that had witnessed generations of carefully managed truths. Miss Thornfield's story was one of love complicated by secrecy, loyalty tested by impossible choices, and the terrible burden of protecting a family that could never acknowledge her true place within their history. In the quiet that followed, a small sound came from the writing desk, the soft whisper of paper settling into new arrangement. Among the scattered correspondence, a fragment of sealing wax bore the fresh impression of the Blackwood crest, while a letter, partially visible beneath other documents, showed Lord Adrian's handwriting in lines that spoke of intention to acknowledge what honor demands, regardless of consequences to established arrangements. The evidence suggested communications that had caused considerable distress to all parties, while the timing of such correspondence, so close to the tragedy that had claimed Lord Adrian's life, carried implications that extended far beyond mere family embarrassment. Mrs. Fairfax gathered the tea service with her usual silent efficiency, though her movements suggested familiarity with crises that required careful management rather than public resolution. As she departed, her glance toward Miss Thornfield carried the weight of long understanding between servants who had devoted their lives to preserving what others took for granted. The morning had revealed how devotion could become dangerous when the objects of such devotion faced choices that threatened everything their loyal servants had spent decades protecting. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a clock chimed the hour with measured authority, marking time toward revelations that would prove more perilous than the family secrets they had been designed to protect. Miss Thornfield remained at her writing desk, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived in the shadows of a family that could never publicly acknowledge her existence, while the botanical texts and preparation materials whispered of knowledge that could transform devotion into destruction when love and loyalty faced the ultimate test of exposure. The great hall had been restored to its evening dignity, though the space now served a more solemn purpose than historical pageant, its ancient stones bearing witness to revelations that would prove more dramatic than any medieval ceremony. The late afternoon light filtered through diamond-paned windows with deliberate restraint, casting familiar geometric patterns across Persian carpets that had absorbed the echoes of tragedy, while the scent of beeswax and old wood mingled with something more troubling, the lingering presence of secrets that had festered in aristocratic silence for too long. Inspector Alleyn had arranged the surviving members of the household with theatrical precision, though this performance would serve justice rather than family pride, and its audience would be history itself. Lady Honoria occupied her position of honor with characteristic composure, her walking stick planted firmly between gloved hands as she surveyed the assembly with dignity that could not entirely disguise her apprehension about the truth to come. Miss Lydia Thornfield sat with mechanical precision near the tall windows, her hands folded with the same controlled efficiency that had marked her 20 years of devoted service, though something in her bearing suggested knowledge too dangerous to carry in silence any longer. Dr. Julian Whitmore had positioned himself near his medical bag, his scholarly demeanor unable to mask the gravity of discoveries that had transformed his dual vocations into instruments of moral complexity, while Captain Geoffrey Harcourt stood with theatrical awareness of the drama about to unfold. Mrs. Fairfax maintained her customary position by the service entrance, her keys making soft domestic music as she moved with the quiet authority of one whose long service encompassed household secrets that others preferred to forget. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began, with the courtesy that had served him through countless investigations, his voice carrying calm authority that could transform drawing rooms into courts of justice. "We gather to examine the circumstances of Lord Adrian's death, which the evidence confirms was neither accidental nor natural. The poison employed, digitalis in concentrated form, was administered with precision that speaks of intimate knowledge regarding both the substance and the victim's constitution." He moved with deliberate grace toward the ceremonial table where tragedy had unfolded, his practiced eye noting how each participant responded to the approaching revelation. "The method was both symbolically appropriate and practically effective," he continued, his tone maintaining conversational quality that made even serious accusations seem like scholarly discourse. "During yesterday's performance, I observed that the ceremonial chalice had shifted by the breadth of a hand from its rehearsed position. A triviality, one might suppose, yet nothing upon a stage is without significance. The cup bore traces of digitalis applied through muslin cloth that had been impregnated with concentrated extract, then positioned to leach poison into the ceremonial wine during Lord Adrian's climactic speech." Miss Thornfield remained motionless beside the window, her scholarly composure gradually giving way to something more vulnerable as the investigation's focus narrowed toward truths she had spent decades protecting. The evidence of botanical preparation had been discovered in her modest sitting room, the mortar and pestle bearing microscopic traces despite careful cleaning, the treatise on Indian medicinal plants open to extraction methods, and the small brass scale with telltale residue that spoke of careful measurement. "Your expertise in botanical preparations, Miss Thornfield, acquired during colonial service where such knowledge proved essential for household management, provided both means and method," Alleyn observed with gentle precision. "But the how is merely mechanism. The why involves deeper currents of human motivation." He paused, allowing the weight of revelation to settle over the ancient hall. "My examination of the muniment room, guided by your invaluable cataloguing, revealed systematic suppression of certain genealogical facts. The parish records of St. Mark's in the Wold document the christening in 1904 of Lydia Baseborn, whose mother Ellen had served briefly in this household before more permanent arrangements were made for her child's future." Lady Honoria's composure wavered almost imperceptibly, her grip tightening on her walking stick as the implications became clear. Dr. Whitmore's scholarly features registered profound understanding of discoveries that had tormented his conscience, while the others absorbed revelations that transformed their understanding of relationships they had taken for granted. Lord Adrian had recently learned what previous generations preferred to suppress. Alleyn continued with quiet certainty. "His correspondence reveals intention to acknowledge publicly what honor demanded be recognized. Miss Thornfield's position as his half-sister and legitimate member of the Blackwood family. His noble purpose, however, would have destroyed both the carefully constructed identity you had maintained and the family reputation you had devoted your life to protecting." Miss Thornfield rose from her chair with measured grace that had characterized her throughout their acquaintance, her composure now carrying the weight of acknowledgement rather than concealment. "The Blackwood legacy represents more than social position, Inspector," she said with quiet dignity that transcended her circumstances. "It is the foundation upon which this house has endured through centuries of change. Lord Adrian's nobility of purpose would have destroyed everything we had worked to preserve. I chose to eliminate that threat, believing preservation of the family honor justified any personal sacrifice." The great hall absorbed her confession into its catalogue of family secrets, while the afternoon light continued its progress across ancient flagstones that had witnessed generations of carefully managed truth. Love and loyalty had been twisted into deadly purpose when family honor conflicted with personal recognition. while the very devotion that had made Miss Thornfield invaluable had ultimately made her dangerous when threatened with exposure. Lady Honoria's voice carried aristocratic authority tempered by genuine grief. "Inspector Alleyn, we shall behave as Blackwoods have always behaved." The ancient house seemed to settle around her words, accepting this latest tragedy into its long history of family crises managed with dignity, while the evidence of poison and passion whispered of devotion that had consumed itself in the very act of preservation it sought to achieve. The final performance had ended, not with applause, but with the quiet dignity of acknowledgement that justice, like family honor, demanded its proper forms be observed. 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 Forms be observed.